like 3 foot tall, dark beings that were small in unison, like little soldiers, coming down 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, down the stairwell. And I saw them, and I knew instantly within my terror that they were there to capture me, because suddenly it was ingrained in my mind that this was not supposed to happen. I remember an alternate life. I'm a 55-year-old man that is recording this in the hopes that someone else out there in the world that may stumble upon this podcast, this video, might have the same scenario going on in their life. As I said in the previous podcast, that I shared a lot of the memories that happened to me, and I want to share maybe the beginning of this scenario that's happened. I grew up in the western part of Augusta County, Virginia. That is it's in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. My parents had bought some property that they deemed or called a camp. And upon this bit of property butted up to the backside of the beginning of the Little North Mountain, which is the beginning of the Appalachian Mountains. And upon this property was a log cabin. The log cabin itself was built in the era of 1720 by the German Quakers. And my dad had, in the early 60s, mid-60s, before I was born, had worked on the cabin, got it fixed up, livable, that kind of thing. Put a kitchen in it and all this stuff. So just got it to where it was livable. He and my mom had stayed there. Eventually, my grandparents came, bought a trailer, came out there and lived on the, on the other property as well. My dad has always been in the car business like myself. They built a huge garage to do antique car restoration work and painting. And he had started that out, and then I was born. And my earliest memory of a very traumatic event happened, I'm guessing now, at about the year 1970. I was very small, probably about 3-4 years old. And I remember sleeping in the cabin, and it was, as a reference, I remember that I was just beginning to drink out of a regular cup. You got to remember that many, many years ago, they didn't have sippy cups and all this crap that they have today. Everything's so modern and convenient today, but back then it was more rustic and, more simplified. So I remembered that I was thirsty. I woke up. I remembered my dad, how the old dads from old school days wore the boxer shorts and T-shirts, wife beater shirts. He had gotten up, had kind of clicked. I could see down kind of the hallway. He clicked the TV off, but I was still visible to see the TV. The TV totally just went off. Everything was quiet and dark and silent in this cabin. And I remember just, having this feeling as a small child that, whoa, it's kind of scary, being a little guy and you're kind of alone and blah, 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 and you hope to go back to sleep. But I remember kind of in the kitchen, there was this incessant drip, 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 something like that of course, can get on your nerves. It started to bother me, and I wish at that moment, I still remember wishing that I could get up out of the bed and be big enough guy to get up and go and cut that damn faucet off. Okay? That's what I had wished at that moment. But I couldn't. I was small. I was scared, the dark, blah, blah, blah. It was very dark in this place. And I kind of was staring around, and then all of a sudden I saw in the distance, and the TV, bloop, came right back on again. And I couldn't, it was like, damn. I mean, of course I wouldn't say that as a child, but I was like, whoa, the TV came on by itself. That's not supposed to happen. That's not something that's supposed to occur in the reality that I was getting accustomed to. You saw something, it didn't move by itself, it didn't cut off and on by itself. This wasn't part of my knowledge base at that moment. I started watching the TV, and I knew somehow, somewhere, that my parents and my father was asleep. I was alone, and I started watching the damn TV. Of course. And what else are you gonna do? And there was this movie, black and white, of a courtroom setting where some man was getting tried for something that he did not do or commit. And don't ask me how I know this knowledge. I just knew it. And it was an old movie. I'm talking like maybe in the 40s or so. I mean, you could just tell by the grain and the effect of the movie itself. And I'm a movie buff anyway. The guy gets up. He goes backwards and jumps through this huge paned window, like, in this colonial courtroom setting, and busts through that. And then all of a sudden, it's like, bloop, everything goes out. And what happened is that suddenly I look to my right beside my bed, and I see two figures that looked like they were composed of cigarette smoke. They had perfect outlines, perfect composure in, like, it looked like a black and white photograph, but it was transparent and it was contained of cigarette smoke. The one gentleman I saw looked like he was dressed in one of those long flowing cottony shirts that had the billowy sleeves on it. And there was a younger, like a teenage boy standing next to him. And they just seemed like they were dressed in like colonial period attire. And I laid there in total abject fear, because suddenly it was ingrained in my mind that this was not supposed to happen. I knew that at 3-4 years old. I knew this wasn't supposed to happen in reality. And I looked at them, and they looked at me in perfect clarity. And they said nothing, but they just stared down at me like, what are you doing in our house? Now, remember, I was living in a cabin built in 1720, registered in Augusta County, Virginia. And it was a historical thing. So I'm like, what the hell? I remembered I pulled the covers, the blankets up over my head, and I was just praying to, whatever, like pleading in my mind, please go away, please go away, please go away. And then bam. Of course, it just goes dark. I don't remember anymore. The reason I told you this story is because I'm prefacing, this is a prelude to a lot of the things I think that occurred to create the motion and to create the effect of what I'm experiencing today, or in the last 2-3 years of my life. The next very significant thing that happened when I was a child was, here again, we've got to go back to the context of early 1970 living, where maybe the older generation like myself will remember this. The younger ones will not. But at that time, living in the country, living, 10, 15 miles from the nearest city or town, going to the grocery store is like once a month kind of thing. Like in the olden days, it wasn't that drastic, but, we had television and all that stuff. But I'm talking, it was, more of a country style setting where, you don't go to you don't go to the city every day or whatnot. So, what happened was here again, I think I was advanced in age a little bit. I was probably about 4 to 5. I'm thinking more like 4 to 5-ish. I remember that I was sitting in the living room and my mother was in the kitchen area, which there was a hallway that went back toward the end of the cabin. There was an addition. She was ironing on an ironing board. And it was probably lunchtime. And I remembered specifically that getting a bowl of SpaghettiOs was a very big deal to a small child. Okay? I mean, it's here today we have so many conveniences, so many things, so many choices. In retrospect, the limitations of what you can get and not was a big deal back then, So I remember specifically getting a bowl of SpaghettiOs because it was a real treat. Okay? And I had this little wicker rocking chair that I sat in, and I remember I had a purple sweater on. And I remember that there was a TV that was kind of propped up against the stairwell that went up to what I call the attic of the cabin. And it was like the upstairs, where they had the comb over the roof and all that stuff, and it was used for storage and whatnot. So I was sitting there, and there was something on the TV, and I seem to remember back in those days, there were still a lot of black and white westerns that kind of came on, and I seem to remember being a bit entranced with the Lone Ranger kind of thing and all that. I'm talking 50s TV shows here, 50s, early 60s that, played reruns to the 70s. So I was sitting there, and I was getting ready. I had the bowl in my hand, and I looked up, and it was diagonal. Their stairwell came in. It came down, like right in front of me. There was an angle, and then a stoop, and then you turned, and you came down into the living room area. And all of a sudden, inside of me, inside of my being, I got this real cold, panicky feeling of dread, fear, doom. And I looked up, and all of a sudden, like a living nightmare kind of thing, that I saw these very small, like 3 foot tall, dark beings that were small in unison, like little soldiers, coming down 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, down the stairwell. And I saw them, and I knew instantly within my terror that they were there to capture me. Suddenly, in full broad daylight panic, what they did is I knew in my mind that they had this power. They suddenly locked my vocal cords, and I was getting ready to scream bloody murder to my mother. And suddenly, I was incapacitated where I could not scream, and suddenly I could not move my body at all. I was suddenly locked in place, and I remember trying to move my fingers, and I remember the bones inside of my fingers were moving up against the flesh on the outside of my skin. It was really horrific and traumatic. And that occurred, and then I have, bam, there's absolutely no more memory of that whatsoever. And if there's a little inkling of memory, it's, it's almost like a little bit of an outer body experience to where I just, maybe it was my imagination of what this next part I was seeing, but I knew that they had got me and they were carrying me back up the stairwell to the darkness or wherever they were going. I don't know. And that's the end of that memory. I mean, to be honest with you, it is difficult for me to explain this because I have to remember it and try to give the story enough of sensibility where you can understand it. But basically, after that event happened where I was possibly captured by, I don't know what it was. I have no clue, and I've been still trying to figure it out to this day. But I, for the longest time, thought that they were some type of ghostly entities that lived in the attic. I also contemplated later in time when I became an adult that I was possibly abducted by some type of alien of some sort. And then, excuse me, and then I also contemplated that these were some type of multidimensional beings. And that's sort of where I'm sticking with as of today. Multidimensional beings. And there's kind of a reason I'm going with that. You know, what happens with children is that children are smart. I mean, I'm not just talking about myself, which I don't think I'm overly intelligent, but I think that children definitely, have the ability to adapt, and they begin to adapt to their surroundings, whatever surrounding it is. And what happened as time went on, I had one other really significant event that happened probably, and here again, I cannot, I'm talking here again 5 to 6 years old, is that I remember that our grandparents came over to the cabin. We had this really long antique table. I mean, it was like the old pioneer style table. And I believe it was probably around Thanksgiving time. It seemed like a kind of a gathering. So I remember my grandmother, grandfather, mother, father, and my brother. I have a brother that was 2.5 years younger. He is 2.5 years younger. But I remember sitting on this chair, and, of course, you've got the dinner and the dinner plates and all this stuff. And here again, we're country people. We're not fancy. And all of a sudden, what happened in my memory is that I knew that they were coming for me because I had begun to gather a distinct hypersensitive ability to know when they're coming. I don't know where that came from. It just developed. And it gave me a sense of at least acknowledgement that I was getting ready to get terrorized again or whatever. But I was sitting there at this long table, and I seem to remember that how kids are, I was like Indian style cross-legged in the chair. And suddenly what happened is that I knew that they were coming. I knew that they were going to get me. And what happened is that everything around the table was going on like normal. They were eating, they were chatting, they were talking, they were going on like everything was absolutely freaking normal. And suddenly what happened is that I rose up, okay? I'm talking about rising up out of my chair, and I actually levitated toward the ceiling beams in the ceiling of the cabin. And what happened is I slowly started moving around, still in this Indian style leg, sitting. But I was floating in the air, and I still to this day can remember that feeling of levitation. And I looked over, and they were still going like normal, like nothing had occurred. And what always happened is they would float me over and to where I think I was going to enter the attic area through the stairwell, going up. And then, boom, I have absolutely no memory of anything that occurs after that. It is just like blank darkness. So what I have come to understand, at least into what I have delved in, is that I believe that they have the ability to separate your consciousness. I think what they do is they take a bit of, I don't know how to explain it, but I think that they take a split of your soul or your spirit or your consciousness, and they can separate that from your physical body, leave you remaining where you are, and separate you from yourself and take a portion of you that they need or that they want to contact and talk to. Or whatever they do, I don't know. But then later, as of the last year or so, I've begun to think or formulate an opinion as to what happened with that. So I wanted to preface this whole thing with explaining this to you about the things that happened to me as a child. And then, you don't know what's happening to you because, time is always moving. You're always moving forward. And we, as human beings, tend to forget things and get over things and move on and go on with your life and get over, negative things. We have the ability to kind of push that out of our minds. I firmly believe that. People forget pain, a bad event, a broken bone, yeah, it hurt. I remember it hurting, but, it's kind of like, it doesn't hurt today, so I don't have to deal with that. So our minds develop this ability to just move on. And I think that's what I did as well. So I had later, there were other events that happened as well. One really significant one that I guess I should explain is that, back in the 70s, of course, and here again, we lived on private property that was not close to a road or other people or blah, blah, blah. I remember being a kid, being alone a lot. You could get on the property and meander around and play with this, we had a lot of property. And I remember I was in the back end of the cabin where the back door was open, and I was kind of playing in the kitchen floor area. And, here again, you try to forget and forgive, and you move on with your life, and you want to be a kid. And I think at this time I was probably roughly in the 7 to 8 year old age. And suddenly, in the core of my stomach, right in my stomach and my chest area, I got that cold, damp, fearful, steely feeling of immediate terror. And all of a sudden, I jumped up, and I knew that they were coming for me, and I did not want them to get me. So I jumped up, and I got one running pace out, and then suddenly, like, my legs are far apart, like in still motion, bam. And then what they did is they slid me back. I was a solid figure, legs spread, arched open in a running position, and all of a sudden, like a tractor beam, a magnetic tractor beam, they slid me back, and I remember sliding across the floor, and I got one more step, and then bam, they slid me back again, and then that was it. Again, no more memory, nothing. It's a blank slate. It's a blank slate. Okay. So, here again is being a kid. I remember telling my mom, because you're a child and you're, I don't know, back in those days, I don't know, people just did not have like this communication style they have today where, hey, I've got a problem and I need to talk to you and, something's bothering me. And it just didn't feel that way back then. I don't know. I've talked to a lot of other people and it was kind of like, parents were either doing their thing or they were working and they just, they were in their world and you're in your world as a kid and you go to school, you come home, homework, chores, get things done. You try to play when you can. You try to be happy when you can. And, wow. one of these really otherworldly event that happened to me that kind of made me think and trigger is that my dad was a business guy, and he had developed a company. And I remember I was here again at about 5 years old. And I remember this very, very specifically, is that I think we went somewhere. I can't remember if it was Florida or he had dealings on the east coast of Virginia in the Tidewater area. And we went to some place, and this place was a photography studio. And I think this is what I remember, is that he was getting these pamphlets or promotional material developed up to give out to people for his business and blah, blah, blah. Well, I was standing around there, and all of a sudden the photographer looked at me, and I'm going to just say this in all humility. I was a cute kid, okay? Not so cute anymore, but I was a cute kid back then. So I had this little jacket on, pants on, looking nice. I remember, I was made to dress appropriately back then, especially if we went somewhere. You had to look decent, of course. So the photographer said, hey, why don't we get him, which referring to me. I remember I held this little box, and the photographer, I held this box out, and, he posed me and got me to smile. And he said, hey, we're going to use your kid, to put on this promotional pamphlet thing. And I was like, cool. I mean, I felt like, whoa, it was kind of a neat thing to have happen. It was like a little whoa, it was nice, So I stood there. The guy took these pictures, and, we got it done. And I was like, yeah, cool. So, as time goes on, you kind of forget about that happening. And I thought in my mind that this promotional thing, had occurred, and Dad got the pamphlets, and, it was distributed. And my dad was good about kind of saving these souvenir things, or, he'd get labels made. He'd save 100 labels just because, nostalgia or whatever. So I remember one day I was over at my grandmother's place, and I was probably, I don't know, 7, 8 years old, 9 years old. And I remember talking to my grandmother, and I said, hey, Grandma, I said, do you have any of those, or does Dad have any of those pamphlets where my photograph was on the pamphlet where I was holding the box, this little box? And she said, what? I said, yeah. I said, remember when we went wherever we went, because we take these trips sometimes. And I said, remember when I got the photograph of me on the pamphlet with the box? And she says, I have no idea what you're talking about. So, I was a little flustered with that. I was not upset, but I was genuinely puzzled. So anyway, I went and talked to my dad about it. And I said, hey, Dad, you remember when we went so-and-so to this place? We had to go to this photographic studio. And I said, the guy said, hey, I'm going to take a picture of your son with this little box, smiling, and this was, they were going to, a promotional pamphlet. He said, that never happened. And I said, what? He said, that never happened. I said, you're kidding me. He said, no. I said, it never happened, boy. He said, it just didn't happen. I don't know what you're talking about. That threw me for a loop. I was like, I just let it go. Because, you're not going to, as a kid, you're not going to argue with you, especially my dad. My dad was a piece of hell. Okay, he is his way or the highway. And I was like, okay. I wasn't going to argue it or demand that he understood what I was saying. I was like, whoa. But here again, what do? I don't have the pamphlet. I don't have the proof. I don't have this. All I have is in my own mind the memory of what happened. And I've carried that all these years, like almost 48, 49 years of my life, I've carried that memory with me of that event occurring. But the rest of my family at that moment has no detail of that memory. Because it was kind of a big deal. Back then, getting your photograph taken, especially with a promotional material, was a big deal. It's not like today where people got cell phones and they take 1 million pictures a day or more, you know? So you just let it go. You move on. Life moves on, and you just learn how to adapt, and you keep on going. You know, when I'm telling this story, I realize that I'm having to honor myself. I've learned to do that in my life. I haven't always honored who I am, you know, and I think a lot of people in the world can say that they don't often pay tribute to who they have been or who they are today. And I've had to learn that. But I remember specifically this one, here again, I was probably about six or seven. And I remembered that I had this beautiful dream. I had this dream that over in my grandparents' trailer, they had this. Now, here again, you've got to honor yourself as a small boy. And I'm doing that right now. Is that I remembered in the dream that there was this big drawer in my grandmother's kitchen. There was a secret drawer where they had all the coolest toys, like Tonka toys, metal Tonkas, and all these, you know, trucks and really cool stuff that a kid that age would just absolutely love, like a Christmas day. And I mean, it was just a magnificent event that I remembered in the dream, finding this drawer and all of these magnificent toys with lights, and they were cool and they were brand new. They weren't hand-me-downs, and they were all for me. And I was like, whoa, this is so great. This is great. It's wonderful. And I remember I said, oh my gosh, it's so beautiful. It's great. I can't wait to get over to Grandma's house. So I got up and got dressed and told him, I said, I'm going to see Grandma real quick. I'm going over there. And he was like, 75 yards away, and knocked on the door and went in. And I remember going in and said, hey, Grandma, hey, Granddad, how you doing? I just want to check out something. And I went into the kitchen. And I remembered that I just pulled every drawer she had open. I remembered that, she had these bottom cabinets, and I was looking through there because it was such a significant thing that I knew that that drawer of toys was there. But when I got to Grandmother's house, they weren't there. I couldn't find them. There was no secret drawer. There was no secret cabinet opening. There was nothing there but just the normal pots and pans and dishes and, stuff under the sink and all that stuff that you normally have. And I don't know why that memory has always stuck with me, but it has. Because it was like I experienced one reality, and then when I wake, there's a different reality. And maybe that's why I'm going through the throes of just saying this, explaining this story as a prelude to the other things that I'm going to tell you about. Because therefore, I'm trying to articulate this story to where it's going to make sense in the future here for you guys and for me. Since these things had occurred, here again, I'm going to just preface this or explain this as well, is that you just live your life, you go on, you keep moving on, because you had no other choice. Life is life. Things that happen, happen. You just go on. But I remembered that my dad, here again, we're between 7, 8 years old, something like that. My brother was younger. Man, I hated this, and I hated this a lot. My dad was always a night owl. This guy would stay up. I never knew when he slept. This guy was incredible. So anyway, I think that he just, I don't know. It was a mystery, my father, okay, still to this day. Is that he seemed like he never slept, but he would come over to the cabin in the middle of the day. stripped down to his boxer shorts and his t-shirt again, and he would lay on Mom and Dad's bed, and he would make us take a damn nap. You know, I'm talking between like 1 and 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and I freaking hated that shit. Because I'm a kid. I got endless energy. I can move and groove and go, and my brother was the same way. So anyway, in the boredom of him sleeping and snoring, my brother and I, we would lay in the bed, and all of a sudden I developed this ability. Don't know where it came from, don't know what it's about. But I could lay on my side, and I could put my arm straight up in the air, and I could lock my arm in place. All I had to do was I kind of had to talk to my arm. And I would say to my arm, I'd go, okay, you're gonna remain still. And then suddenly I would feel this, a little bit of like energy, like around the outside of my arm. And then I would just let go. And my arm would stay there. And my arm would stay there as long as I wanted it to. And I would do that as just a stupid kids game that you do when you're bored and you have nothing else to do, because I certainly didn't want to sleep, but I had this ability to hold my arm in place. And then this other really weird idea kind of developed in my mind, is that I remember, here again, take it with a grain of salt, because I do too. I remember knowing how to levitate. I'm like, what? To myself. I'm this is as baffling to me as it probably is to you. And I was like, what? I remember knowing how to do it. Okay? But I don't know how to do it. If that makes any sense to you. Because it doesn't make any sense to me either. I'm like, what? Yeah, stuff like that. Stuff like that still haunts me to this day. Because I remember, okay, grain of salt here, great big rock of salt. I remember somebody teaching me that. Yeah. So, there's more to come. And I think I'm going to go ahead and cut this one down. But, for those of you that have listened to this story so far, it's an ongoing story. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your interest, and thank you for being kind in advance. Because, a lot of people can be cruel and mean and blah, 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 which is fine. I can take it. I'm a grown man. I got thick shoulders, man. But my main reason for doing this is to record it and to share and to find out if someone else also in the world has experienced what I've experienced with remembering another life. Thank you.